The council chamber was already screaming when Calder walked in. 4 species, 4 fleets, 72 hours before the corridor between Ythor and the Outer Rim turned into a graveyard. I stood at the back of the chamber behind the Vorath delegation, watching High Marshal Dren pound his fist on the obsidian table hard enough to make the translators flinch. The Grellian ambassador had his secondary mouth open, which meant he was either laughing or threatening. With Grellians, those are essentially the same thing. The Keth representative was silent, which was somehow worse than all the noise, and at the center of it all, my husband sat with a paper notebook, a pen, and a cup of something that smelled like scorched bark. Nobody looked at him. They never did. I am Thesavari Kell, 3rd daughter of the Vorath Imperium, and I have been recording this account for the Galactic Conclave archives, because someone has to say it plainly. What happened at Ythor was not a miracle. It was not diplomacy in any form the galaxy had ever practiced before. What it was, I still struggle to name, but I will try. I married Calder Voss 14 months before Ythor. The arrangement was my mother's idea, which tells you everything about how valued I was in the succession order. The Vorath human ceasefire was 3 years old, and fragile as dried bone, and the Empress needed something to stabilize it. A gesture. A bridge. Her 3rd daughter, who had no fleet to command, and no political weight to throw, was exactly the right kind of gesture. I met him in a receiving hall, on neutral station Orith 9. He was shorter than I expected. Humans always are. He had dark hair going gray at the edges, a jaw that suggested he had slept on his arm the night before, and he was wearing a jacket with a frayed cuff that no diplomat from any other species would have allowed through the entrance scan. He looked at me with eyes that were neither afraid nor performatively bold. He just looked, the way you look at something you are genuinely curious about. He extended his hand. I had been briefed on the custom. I took it. His grip was warm and brief and completely unpretentious. Calder Voss, he said. I know who you are, I told him. I know you do, he said. I just figured we should say it out loud anyway. I decided then that this would be a very long arrangement. My attendants tried to comfort me that first week. They said things like, at least he is not aggressive, and at least the station has good air filtration. The Vorath court, when they heard about the match, went quiet in that specific way that means everyone is too polite to say what they are thinking. My older sister sent me a message with 3 words, "You poor thing." I did not respond. I watched Calder instead. I watched him the way I had been trained to watch political threats, cataloging behavior, looking for patterns. He woke early every morning, before the station light cycle shifted. I asked him why once, early in the 2nd month, when I found him already at the small table in our shared quarters with the notebook and the terrible drink. He looked up, not startled. Old habit, he said. My grandfather fished before sunrise, said the quiet was different then, better for thinking. I did not know what fishing was at the time. I wrote the word down and looked it up later. A human practice of waiting, patiently, at the edge of something vast, for something worth catching. I started watching him differently after that. In formal sessions, the other delegations barely concealed their contempt for him. Humans were the newest species at the conclave table. Their lifespan was insultingly short by galactic standards, their biology embarrassingly fragile, their technology 3 centuries behind the Vorath and 5 behind the Grellians. High Marshal Dren once said, loudly enough to be heard across the chamber, that negotiating with humans was like negotiating with the weather, except weather occasionally produced results. Calder heard it. He did not respond. He wrote something in the notebook. I found I could not look away from that notebook. He filled it slowly, methodically, in handwriting I could not read. I asked him once what language he wrote in. He said it was English, same as he always spoke, just faster than a translator could keep up with. He was writing questions, he told me, things he did not know yet. You write down what you do not know? I asked. That's most of it, he said. A Grellian secondary official named Call insulted me publicly at a formal dinner in our 4th month on the station. He implied, with the particular precision that Grellians use for cruelty, that I had been attached to a lesser species because I was a lesser daughter. He said it in front of 9 delegates, 2 recording attendants, and a buffet table of food that no one was eating anymore. I kept my expression neutral. I had been trained for this. Calder said nothing that evening. The following morning, Call's funding application to the Human Conclave Trade Bureau was declined. No explanation given. No confrontation. No drama. The application simply ceased to exist in any active queue, and when Call's office inquired, they were told the matter had been reviewed at the ambassadorial level and found lacking in merit. I asked Calder about it that afternoon. He was reading something, feet up on the chair across from him, in a way that would have gotten a Vorath soldier discharged for insubordinate posture. "Did you do that?" I asked. He turned a page. "Do what?" I decided not to press it, but I noticed that I was no longer finding the frayed cuff irritating. The convoy crisis came in month 7. A Vorath trade convoy, carrying medical synthesizers through the outer corridor, was seized by Keth marauders. 40 crew members held, no ransom demand issued yet, which was the most frightening part. The conclave convened. The Vorath Imperium positioned 3 warships. The Grellian sovereignty suggested a task force, then immediately argued about who would pay for it. Time passed. People talked. Nothing moved. Calder disappeared from the station for 6 days. His aide, a young human woman called Priya, with short hair and extremely efficient walking pace, told me he was working. When I asked working where, she said she would find out and let me know. She never let me know. I began to suspect she had known all along and simply assessed that I was not going to do anything useful with the information. On the 7th day, the convoy was released. 40 crew, all present, all breathing. The Keth spokesperson issued a brief statement that they had reached an agreement and considered the matter resolved. No military engagement. Not a single shot confirmed fired. I was standing in the corridor outside the communications room when Calder came back through the docking entrance. He looked like someone had taken a full human and then removed about a fifth of him through a slow drain. His jacket had a new scorch mark on the left sleeve. The notebook was in his hand, open to a page dense with writing. "What did you do?" I asked him. He looked at me for a moment. "Found the person in that group who was tired of what they had become," he said. "Gave him a reason to choose something different." "And if they had killed you?" He thought about it genuinely, which was somehow worse than if he had been dismissive. "Then someone else would have had to figure it out," he said. But I had a pretty good read on the room. I told myself I was angry at his recklessness. I told myself that for approximately 4 days before I admitted, alone, in the small hours of the morning while he slept, that what I had actually felt for those 6 days was afraid. Not afraid for the Vorath convoy. Afraid for him. I did not know what to do with that, so I did what Vorath are trained to do with inconvenient information. I filed it away and watched him more carefully. The thing about watching Calder Voss closely is that you start to see what is not there. No posturing, no performance of strength. He never once walked into a room trying to make anyone feel small, which distinguished him immediately from approximately 80% of the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. He did not leverage status. He did not leverage fear. When he disagreed with someone, he asked them questions until they either changed their mind or revealed the real reason they held their position, at which point, he addressed that instead. It was, I realized slowly, a form of precision that looked nothing like precision from the outside. It looked like patience. It looked, frankly, like someone who had nothing to offer and was therefore simply being pleasant. It was neither of those things. Month 14, Ythor. The territory had been contested for 2 decades, 4 species claiming historical sovereignty over a corridor that connected 3 major trade routes. It had flared before and cooled before, but this time someone had moved a fleet without authorization, and then another someone had responded in kind, and within 11 days, there were 4 fleets in a corridor that could barely contain one, and the conclave had issued a 72-hour window before authorizing engagement. Authorized engagement was the polite phrase for the thing that would kill approximately 40,000 people in the first exchange alone. The emergency session was chaos from the first minute. High Marshal Dren was at his operatic worst, recounting Vorath territorial claims going back 3 centuries in a voice designed to carry across battlefields. The Grellian ambassador had 3 of his mouths moving simultaneously. The Keth block sat in stone silence that somehow amplified everything around it. The 4th claimant, a small species called the Veen, were represented by an elderly female who looked like she was quietly praying to something. Calder sat in the human delegation seats to the left of the main floor, which were considered secondary seats in conclave protocol, a slight that dated back to humanity's admission to the body and had never been corrected. He was writing in the notebook. Dren noticed him at one point and said, "To no one and everyone, the human is taking notes. How charming. Perhaps he will write a book about the war." Some of the Grellian delegation made a sound that functioned as laughter. Calder looked up. He did not smile. He did not flush. He looked at Dren with an expression I can only describe as a person making a small decision and moving on. Then he looked back down at the notebook. At the 90-minute mark, Dren stood formally and proposed a motion to remove the human delegation from emergency proceedings on the grounds that human interests in Ythor were peripheral. The motion required a second. It got one. Calder stood, closed the notebook, picked up his jacket, and walked out of the chamber. I followed him. He was sitting on the floor of the corridor outside, back against the wall, notebook open on his knee. Not dejected, working. I stood over him for a moment, in the full diplomatic dress of the Vorath Imperium, feeling the specific absurdity of the situation. "They just removed you from the session," I said. "I know," he said, without looking up. "Can you sit down for a minute? I need to ask you something, and I think better when I'm not looking up at people." I sat on the floor of a galactic conclave corridor in my formal dress. If my mother had seen this, she would have ended the ceasefire herself. "What does Vorath actually need from Ythor?" he asked. "Not the claim, not the history. What does your people actually need right now? The real resource need, under all the political language." I looked at him. He was writing before I even answered, leaving space for my words. So I told him the truth, the actual truth, which I had never said aloud in any session, because it was the kind of truth that felt like weakness if you named it in front of enemies. The Vorath northern districts had a water processing problem. 3 major filtration stations running at reduced capacity for 2 years. Ythor sat above a water mineral corridor that would solve it in 18 months if we had access rights. Everything else, the history, the flags, the fleet positioning, was built on top of that one real thing. He nodded and wrote. Then he asked me to help him contact the non-official representatives of the other 3 claimants. Not ambassadors, not military. Trade engineers, resource coordinators. The people who knew what the problem actually was. We spent 40 minutes on the corridor floor. I made 7 communication requests through my personal diplomatic access. He talked to people I had never thought to talk to, in a tone that made them forget they were talking to someone who had just been removed from the room that controlled their fate. What emerged over those 40 minutes was this. All 4 species were fighting over water processing routes that ran through Ythor. All 4 had resource scarcity problems that were driving the political pressure. None of them had proposed a shared infrastructure solution because they had all been preparing for war instead, and war does not leave much room for engineering proposals. He went back to the station quarters. He did not sleep. I helped him with the Vorath linguistic sections. He wrote the rest. 11 pages, 4 languages, technical specifications, resource sharing ratios, a phased construction timeline, projected cost offsets that made the whole arrangement net positive for all 4 parties within 6 years. Priya proofread it at 3 a.m. station time, eating something from a container and correcting his grammar in the Grellian sections with the calm focus of someone who did this regularly. With 4 hours left on the conclave's window, Calder walked back into the chamber. He was not credentialed for re-entry. The door attendant stopped him. He said, politely, and without raising his voice, that he had a document relevant to active proceedings, and requested 30 seconds to present it to the session chair. The attendant, who had not been briefed on what to do with polite humans holding paper notebooks, made a judgment call and stepped aside. Dren rose immediately. This delegate was removed from proceedings. This is a procedural violation. Calder stood at the center of the floor, which you were not supposed to do unless you held the speaking stone, which he did not. He reached into the notebook and pulled out the folded 11 pages. "Hi, Marshal," he said, and his voice was entirely level. "In 4 hours, those 4 fleets engage, and somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people die on the first day. I've been doing the math on the second day, and it gets worse. I've written a proposal that addresses the actual resource problem driving this conflict. It is 11 pages, and page 3 is the part that matters most. You can have me removed again, or you can read page 3. He set it on the table in front of the session chair and stepped back. The chamber was quiet, not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of a large group of beings who had been very loud for a very long time and suddenly did not know what sound to make. The session chair, a vain elder who had been praying quietly for 90 minutes, picked up the document. She turned to page 3. She read it. She passed it to the Keth representative without saying anything. The Keth representative read it and passed it to the Grellian ambassador. By the time it reached Dren, there were already 2 quiet conversations happening at the table. Dren read page 3. He turned to page 4. He turned back to page 3. The vote to delay military engagement passed with 1 hour and 40 minutes remaining on the window. The infrastructure proposal was entered into formal review. The 4 fleets were instructed to hold position. The chamber did not applaud. Galactic conclave proceedings do not work that way. But there was a moment, about 30 seconds after the vote, where nobody spoke and nobody moved. And I watched Calder standing at the edge of the floor with his notebook under his arm, and he looked like a man who was very, very tired and was allowing himself about 15 seconds to feel it before moving on to whatever came next. The Grellian ambassador, who had seconded the motion to remove him, spoke first into that silence. "Human," he said, in his own language, so the translator lagged a half-second behind. "What are you?" It was not a question exactly. It was the sound of a species reconsidering a category. Calder picked up his jacket from the seat where he had left it. "Tired," he said. "Mostly just tired." I walked out with him. We did not speak until we were back in the corridor, and then I stopped walking, and he stopped a few steps ahead, and turned around. "You need to answer me something," I said. He waited. Every other species at that table has something behind them: fleet tonnage, ancient alliances, biological advantages, lifespans that let them outlast the problem. What do you have? What is it that you are actually working with? Because I have been watching you for 14 months and I cannot name it. He thought about it. Genuinely thought. The way he always did. Like the question deserved the real answer and not the easy one. "I genuinely cannot afford to give up," he said. "So I don't." That is not an answer. It's the only true one I have. I have thought about that answer every day since. Here is what I understand now, recording this for the archive, that I did not understand then. Every species in the conclave negotiates from something. The Vorath negotiate from strength, because we built our civilization on the principle that strength makes the argument, and everything else is decoration. The Grellians negotiate from longevity. They outlast pressure, because they have the years to do it. The Keth negotiate from silence, which is its own form of force. Every species comes to the table with a native leverage point, something biological or historical or structural that they lean on when the moment gets hard. Calder had none of those. Humans are not the strongest species. They are not the longest lived. They arrived late to the conclave table and sat in the secondary seats and were told, in many languages and many ways, that their presence was tolerated rather than valued. What humans have, the thing the galaxy did not have a word for and therefore kept misreading as weakness, is a specific and total refusal to accept that a problem is permanent. It is not optimism. Optimism is a feeling. This is something more structural, something closer to a defect in the system that calculates when to stop. Humans do not seem to have that system installed. They look at an unsolvable problem and hear a challenge. They look at a closed door and start drafting 11 pages. In the back-channel communications that circulated through conclave staff in the months after Ythor, I found a phrase that had begun to attach itself to human diplomats. It had started as a mild insult and evolved into something that no longer sounded like one. Translated roughly from Grellian, it meant the stubbornness of creatures who forgot to learn their own limits. The Ythor Accords were signed 6 months later. Calder was not in the signing chamber. He was already somewhere else, working on something else, a trade dispute in the Eastern Corridor that no one else wanted to touch. I signed on behalf of the Vorath Imperium. When High Marshal Dren thanked me for my contributions to the Accord, I said simply, "Thank my husband." Dren was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded and said nothing else, which from Dren was as close to reverence as I have ever seen him manage. I do not know if what I feel for Calder is what Vorath mean when they use the word love. We do not use that word easily. It carries weight in Vorath culture that takes time to earn, and time is something I have given this marriage in amounts I would not have predicted when I stood in that receiving hall and took his hand for the first time. What I know is this: when I wake now, before the station light cycle shifts, I find him already there, at the small table, with the notebook and the terrible drink that smells like scorched bark. Building something out of nothing, the way he always does, because there is always another problem that needs someone who will not stop. I sit beside him. I help with the sections I know better than he does. We work in the quiet that his grandfather apparently found at the edge of water, before the sun came up, in the particular silence that is better for thinking. He never once asked the galaxy to fear him. He just kept solving things until fearing him became beside the point. I married him because my mother needed a gesture, and I was the least valuable piece on the board. I understand now that she made, without knowing it, the single best decision of her political career, because the least valuable daughter married the most dangerous kind of person the galaxy had never thought to watch out for. Not dangerous because he would hurt you. Dangerous because he would sit on the floor outside the room that held your fate and write 11 pages while you were busy making speeches, and then walk back in and put page 3 in front of the person who needed to read it, and he would do it quietly, and he would not stop. He married me for peace. I married him for peace. He turned out to be the reason peace was possible at all.